Welcome to Reading the Room, a literary podcast featuring author interviews and discussions with bookish content creators. I am your host, Jalen, also known as The Bar in the Bookcase on YouTube. Today I am joined by Hilary Leichter, author of Terrace Story, available now from Echo. Hilary Leichter's novel came on my radar because Hernan Diaz, author of Trust, one of my favorite books, when he was on the podcast last summer, he had mentioned that I need to get Hilary on at some point, and I saw that she had a new novel coming out this year, and so I've been eagerly anticipating this book and hopefully talking with Hilary, and it finally happened. So this is really fun to prepare for, and thinking about that novel in relation to Hernan Diaz and his work, I think it's a really fun and engaging conversation about how she's crafted this really mind-bending novel that will break your heart and your mind. If you're unaware about what this novel is about, it follows Annie, Edward, and their young daughter Rose, who live in a cramped apartment. One night, without warning, they find a beautiful terrace hidden in their closet. It wasn't there before, and it seems to only appear when their friend Stephanie visits. But every extra bit of space has a hidden cost, and the terrace sets off a seismic chain of events, forever changing the shape of their tiny home and the shape of the world. How far can the mind travel when it's looking for something that is gone? Where do we put our loneliness, longing, and desire? What do we do with the emotions that seem to stretch beyond the body, beyond the boundaries of life and death? Based on the National Magazine award-winning story, Hilary Leichter's profound second novel asks how we nurture love when death looms over every moment. For one of our most innovative and daring writers, Terrace Story is an astounding meditation on loss, a reverie about extinction, and a map for where to go next. If you enjoy this episode or enjoy the podcast generally, a great way of supporting the podcast is to leave a 5-star review wherever you get those podcasts, or share this episode with friends and family. That is another great way of getting the word out as well. Now, without further ado, let's get into the conversation with Hilary Leichter. Hilary, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Jalen.
So I'll just start. I told you this before we started recording, but this book blew my mind on so many levels. It's like doing everything that like Jalen as a reader loves. It has the like 4-part structure that all plays together. I don't know. It like it feels like your mind is like being bent a little bit while you're reading it, and it's just so fun to see where you're going to go with this. So I'm going to try to do it justice today, but I think to start, I want to ask you about the title, the core story of Terrace Story, and what does Terrace Story mean in the context of this book?
Sure. So, well, thank you for having me, and I'm so glad that you liked it, because when I was writing it, I was thinking like, what would Jalen want to read? So Terrace Story was the title of the short story that I initially wrote, and it describes in the book the types of fictional stories that this couple invents on an imaginary terrace that appears and disappears in their apartment's tiny closet. And so it's thinking about the ways we make meaning of our lives, the lies that we tell each other that sometimes feel truer than the truth. And a lot of times a title will come to me before I even start writing anything. And Terrace Story, it initially was just the thing that I called the story that I was working on, like, oh, that's the Terrace Story. But then I realized that no, that was the name of the story, and then eventually the name of the book. I like that it almost feels like a portmanteau. It's kind of hard to say Terrace Story. You kind of have to slur it together, which feels like it mimics the double helix structure of the narrative in the novel. It folds back on itself. And then it couldn't be balcony story, because I love that prefix terror in terrace, and terrace used to be a word that described land formation. So when you're standing on a terrace in an apartment, you're kind of in midair and on the ground at the same time. So it had all these beautiful resonances in it that I wanted to capture. I think it's a beautiful word to hear and to see on the page. And then the idea of the Terrace Story in the book captured this kind of myth-making, bent storytelling that I wanted to explore.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a perfect title, and I was thinking about it, when I was in the last part of it, and I was kind of going back on my notes and seeing like, how does all this work together? And we'll get there. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but there's so many quotes in this book. I pulled like little nuggets, but there's one where they're talking about Terrace Story, and it's when you're in a place that does not really exist, you can populate it with as many fables and legends as you like. And I was thinking about how you did this book, and I was thinking, well, this is a place fiction doesn't really exist, and you can populate fiction with as many different moving parts as you want to. And I feel like you really did that and kind of encapsulated that in how you wrote the story. And so, does that resonate with you in terms of how you think about writing fiction? Do you feel like the possibilities are endless, or do you feel like there's kind of boundaries there?
Oh no, absolutely. I think the possibilities are infinite. I'm so perturbed and frustrated with rules, with writing rules. I'm frustrated with writing advice too. Show, don't tell bothers me to know, like any sort of maxim about what a book can do just makes me ill. And I think that right now, especially when there are so many ways to make narrative art and so many different ways that people consume that art, it it feels really important to think about the boundaries of a novel and what is possible and what it can do that nothing else can do. And so that's important to me. It was important to me in my first book, and it's important to me with this one too. And I think if there's any through line to my work, which now includes two things, it's that exploration of what the limits of fiction are, and if there are any at all. So I was excited about that, and I was excited about the idea that even though fiction isn't real, it's true. And by writing it, these characters aren't real, but they're now a part of the world. And I think that art in general is the thing that makes life bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, which reverberated with some of the ideas that I was trying to capture.
Absolutely, because I wanted to ask you next about this idea of addition versus subtraction and how that actually played out and how I think that this novel was created. So I want to start with how this is an award-winning story, Terrace story that kind of started. I think I'll let you answer that if that's where it started. But and then there's three other parts now to this, and now it's a novel. So how did you think about adapting that story into the novel form? And do you think that this first chapter does it still stand alone despite the other parts, or is it now a part of this full picture?
It's a great question. For me, I don't know if it still stands alone because now I can't separate it from the way that it's grown in my head. But I think for a reader who has not encountered any of this before, then I think it's the only part of the book that still could potentially stand alone. It's I wrote it to stand alone initially. It was about, I guess it was 2017, and I was living with my husband in a very, very tiny Brooklyn apartment in Park Slope. And, it was like 400 square feet, and it was really cute, but we were on I had to climb over someone's legs to go anywhere, and vice versa. It was that type of space. And so I was dreaming about limited space. I was dreaming about the implications of that, and then even more the kind of dire stakes of our economy right now, where it feels like every form of housing is precarious. And what does it mean to have a home? It means a kind of safety. So all these things were running through my head, and I wrote the short story version, which is just that first chapter. And in the novel, it's called Terrace. And then I was done. It got published. I was like, great, this is finished. And it was accepted for publication, but then it didn't appear in print until spring of 2020, which was obviously a very different time. The claustrophobia of that initial lockdown was still very fresh, and there was this feeling of being very, very close. I was in very close quarters, but also so distant from people too. And that feeling of distance plus claustrophobia was an interesting paradox to me. And I started thinking about the story again. It kind of reopened for me. And now, in retrospect, the way that I think about it is that the story was about a couple that finds a terrace hidden in their tiny apartment. And I sort of found a novel hidden in a short story. I did not think that at the time. That would be too articulate for the beginnings of writing something, which is usually just a jumbled mess in my head. I don't know if I answered your question actually, but that's sort of how it evolved. Whether or not it still stands alone, I don't know. I guess it's not really for me to say, right? What do you think? Because you just read
Yeah,
it.
I think it does. I mean, I was thinking about like, so I was in the fortress section thinking about Stephanie's power, and just thinking about like, so if you do read the story first, like I guess what I'm trying to say is it does stand alone, but I think it's interesting how like you as a novelist are able to take something that you wrote initially and create something entirely new with that kind of structural framework. Like I think that's just such a fascinating thing that fiction, like the minute you add something to fiction, it can become something completely different, but the context of how a reader kind of comes to it, it can change that experience, which is just fascinating to me. And how it now exists in the world in a new way. Like it's all, I don't know, I'm talking very like, I don't know, existentially
No,
about it, but
I think it is an existential question. I think it's about how much power you're willing to give to your readers. And I really believe that two things are true. The book that I wrote is bigger than the one that you get to read, literally because there are drafts and sentences that are cut that exist in the world and in my head, but not in the finished book. And also, the book that you read is bigger than the one I wrote because of what you bring to it as a reader. And that dynamic is very moving to me. And I really feel like being able to release control over something that's finished is can be a wonderful feeling. And also I've been working a little bit on adapting my first book for television, and I'm so not precious about maintaining its structure in that process. And I think that the same can be true for turning a short story into a novel, allowing something to exist for a while in the world in one way, and then being open to it continuing to exist in a different way, which is basically what happens to us too, right? Like you can't go on existing through your life the same way. Life won't let you do that. Things happen to change that. So we constantly have to be sort of evolving and shape shifting. And I think the same thing can happen to art.
and that brings me, so creating this novel, I always like to ask writers about something else that you add to a novel, which is epigraphs. And I thought they were really interesting. I love going back to like seeing how they fit into the novel afterwards. But I wanted to ask you about both of them. The first one is from Galileo, measure what can be measured and make measurable what cannot be measured. What does that mean for you, and how did you pick that as one of your epigraphs?
Well, obviously, I picked it after the fact. I didn't. I mean, maybe some people choose their epigraphs before they start writing, but I can't imagine doing that. It's this moment of editing where you kind of put on your intellectual hat and re-enter what you've made as like a researcher and on a fact-finding mission. And in writing the book, without giving away too much, when I was writing the last section, I ended up reading Galileo and the Starry Messenger, which is, has a lot of his ideas about the cosmos, and a lot of them are wrong or like, not fully correct yet. And it's very beautiful. The language is very beautiful. I was really taken with just the way he describes things, and some of that language made its way into the entire novel, even the parts that aren't about space. And that when I found that quote from him, it struck me as kind of this beautiful code to live by as a novelist, like you could almost rephrase it as try to describe what can be described, and the things that you can't describe, make them describable, and that's not grammatically correct probably, but I read that word measure as a kind of fictional imperative.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I'll save my question for later about Stephanie, but I'm wondering how you did what you did with her, and making that, work in the reader's mind. It's magical in my opinion. But before we get there, one more epigraph here is Virginia Woolf, which is a writer that I've never read her, and I need to. To the Lighthouse has been on my list. Brandon Taylor really likes her, one of my favorite writers. But anyways, so it's, well, we must wait for the future to show, said Mr. Banks, coming in from the terrace. Um, I love it. I don't know if you want to speak on that one too, but
Yeah, I have a good story about this actually. So
okay.
when I finished the first draft of the book, the Galileo quote was the only one that was there. And I'm actually I have a little side eye when it comes to double epigraphs. I feel like, do you really need more than one? That's kind of a feeling that I have sometimes. So I had never planned to add another, but I had this whole fifth section of the book that was not working. It was overwrought. It it wasn't pinned to the perspective of one of the main characters the way that the other sections are. It was wandering around the world and through time. And I went on this mini self-made writing retreat with Emma Copley Eisenberg and Dan Michelle Norris, and we all went up to the Catskills for a weekend and got an Airbnb. And Emma and I went on a hike, and I was talking to her about this section that I was interested in, but that wasn't working. And I tried to describe to her what I was doing, and she said, "Oh, you're writing a time passes," which is basically what I just described. But it's in To the Lighthouse. It's this beautiful section where time shoots forward and is kind of untethered from the characters. It's almost as if time itself is narrating suddenly. And I mean, I was trying to do a time passes, but I'm not Virginia Woolf. And I said, "Oh, you're right." And I had taught that section in a class that I teach at Columbia on time travel in fiction and the uses of time in fiction. And so yeah, it was percolating somewhere in the back of my head. And I went back that night to read it. And that epigraph is in the first paragraph of that section. And the fact that the word terrace appeared there in the prose, just I had goosebumps, and it killed me. And I thought that I don't need this extra section. I need this sentence at the beginning of the book. And that's how it made its way in there. And then I just became completely obsessed with hunting down balconies and terraces and verandas in literature, and there are so many of them. I have a little notebook, I'm keeping track.
Well, so you're making my job easy for me right now, because like I wanted to ask you about how you move through time so quickly in this book. And like, this is a very short book, but so much one happens, but also time moves quickly, and the way that you were able to like wrap that so fast is fascinating. And then, balancing that with the four structures of each part of this book. Like, I'm wondering, so I guess this is a dual question of how you thought about moving through time quickly, and then how that tied to having these very kind of brief contained sections, having four of them in the short novel. How did that all like come to be for you, and like landing on the four structures of the book?
Yeah, I am totally obsessed with thinking about time in novels, and I had been thinking about time in my teaching of novels for a couple of years already. And so it was informing the way that I looked at the world in a way that wasn't even really in my control anymore. But Terrace story is about space. It's about space expanding, space contracting, the space between people, the space between what we think of ourselves and who we actually are, and all of these distances between meaning and between actual locations. And I wanted the book to feel like it was expanding and contracting. I wanted the reader to feel the loss of the terrace in Annie's apartment when it disappears, and I wanted them to feel the luxury of it appearing. And I didn't want to do that using visual tricks. I think that's really fun. I love when books do that. I love when there's like, a word up here and it runs down into a footnote over here. But I think that communicates something different. I don't think that communicates the feeling of fullness or a feeling of emptiness. It communicates like a different emotion. And so I didn't do it that way. And the book became this formal challenge for how do you create and eliminate space for a reader. And I discovered that I think one of the ways to do that is through time. And so the sections sort of had to be in this dance with each other. They had to be orbiting around omissions and what the reader knows, the dramatic irony of what the character doesn't know that we do know. And that dance between when things happen and who experiences them happening, that kind of coupling of time and perspective became a way of indicating space, actually. And so the book started to feel like a house that you can only see one room of it at a time. And when you finally get to see certain rooms, it's 10 years later, or you're seeing that room during a different lifetime than when you saw the attic or when you saw the bedroom. And so that's what I was thinking about. Who knows if it worked? I mean, that's the thing about experiments. It kind of, the experience of experimenting has to be enough, because sometimes it doesn't work.
That's interesting because I'm wondering, like, in terms of this being experimental or how you thought about using this four-part structure. I mean, my next question for you is, do you consider this book to be metafictional? And then, second question, how did you kind of land? Like, did you write from the structures first, or did you kind of, like, for example, Folly, which we'll get to next? Like, where does that, how does that come about for you in terms of craft?
I wrote the book in the order that you read it in. So I didn't write it chronologically, but I wrote it chronologically in terms of the reader's chronology. And I don't know why. I can't answer that question. Yeah, I don't know. Um, the the architectural structures that title each section landed with me first, but I had no idea what was going to happen in each section. I just had this vague sense that it was going to move through the people that occupy one family and the immediate people in the orbit of that family, but I didn't know how or when. I had the word folly in my head, which feels like such a lush literary word. I love the kind of like foolish love built into it, and but also it's obviously a place, a kind of place. And fortress, yes, I knew it was going to be fortress, but I didn't know why. And then as I started writing it about Stephanie, it became this kind of inverted fortress of solitude. It's like a villain origin story or a superhero origin story, depending how you think about Stephanie. But it's also, what is a fortress really? It's something that can keep people safe. It's like where everyone runs to be protected. And so she has this kind of danger about her, but she also can be a source of protection. That was an interesting contradiction to me. And then the final section is called Cantilever, and I had no idea what it was going to be. I knew what character we were going to be spending time with, but that's it. And I don't know, the fact that it was sort of, the titles came first but without any other information, is, I don't know, it's one of those weird mysteries. I can't explain it. I have no idea. I don't know, but I don't outline my books unless you count writing a short story first, like 3 years beforehand as an outline. But I don't map them out, which I think when you're working with multiple timelines and a non-chronological structure is maybe risky. But I don't do any of that. I just spend a long time thinking, and I try and make the space that the book occupies this place that I've visited many, many times in my head. And then suddenly I can't go there alone anymore. Like I need to tell someone else about it. And when I reach that moment, I write down the directions to get there, and that's the book.
That is so interesting to me because this book is all about that idea of, like, creation and Stephanie trying to figure out like what this power is and how much you choose to explain that versus not. And to think about how you kind of landed on these structures and how it kind of your brain birthed this book, like that's just so fascinating to me how it all kind of like it comes together in this like very coherent, interesting narrative where they all speak to each other. Like it's just that's why fiction is so cool, and that's why I have a podcast about it, because I'm like, how do you do it? And let's see what we can come up with. But so let's dive into the other three parts here and what kind of work they're doing. So I want to ask you about Folly, and I'm going to try to, so we don't. I could talk about each of these parts extensively, but this section is doing something interesting with how it contains a story within a story and the king and the hermit story that you contain within this part. So I'm wondering, do you want to set up Folly for listeners and then kind of talk about that story within the story here?
Sure. Yeah, so Folly takes place in a kind of nostalgic past. The years aren't named, but I was thinking of like 1970s New York a little bit when I was writing it. I was thinking about like Grace Paley and Laurie Colwin and that kind of like bantery um love story fiction that's just so bittersweet, and I wanted to capture that. And it's about this couple kind of struggling with what it means to live a life together, but it's also a ghost story a little bit. There's this weird lack of clarity around the order in which things have happened, and some of the characters have insight to what will become of them early, even if they don't know that that's what's happening. So there's like premonition without the knowledge of premonition. And there's a fable woven through the story, which the origin of the fable is not explained. It's said that maybe it was a kind of fairy tale that they told their daughter. Maybe it was, part of a history book that the husband was teaching in school. It's not really, it doesn't have a source. It's just floating there, and it echoes off of their lives and their experiences together. And I think like, I should be clear that none of this is running through my head when I'm writing. It's just writing what needs to be there. And I have no idea where that fable came from initially, but then the editing process is so intentional and finding out what deserves to stay there. And I knew that it deserved to stay there, but I wasn't sure why. But the book is called Terrace Story, and so much of it is about the stories that we tell about ourselves and the stories that help us understand ourselves. And I think I wanted to capture that kind of feeling of pre-memory, where there are things that you just know about the world and you know about yourself and you know about the people you love, but you don't know where those ideas came from. They're like, it's like, I don't know, like a history that exists before history. And I think folklore and fable can accomplish that feeling. There's this sense of time immemorial about fairy tales, like they've been here before us, even though we invented them. I think that's what I was trying to capture and including that. And I also just love the idea of, parts of a book that don't necessarily fit symmetrically. Like, why does it have to be symmetrical? Who said that? It doesn't, I don't think it does. I don't think it does.
Something you just said about this idea of like storytelling. One of my favorite quotes, but I think it's from Fortress, but it's Stephanie listened to their Terrace stories and wondered which parts were true. The truth was overrated, she realized. Knowing that certain parts were fiction, this is what filled her body with an overwhelming warmth. It was love to recognize the inventions and inconsistencies that make a person whole. And I think that's so beautiful. First of all, there's so many like little nuggets of just gorgeous writing and sentiment contained in this book, but tying it to my love of novels and fiction and thinking about, often questions that people ask of novels or just how they think about them is how much of this is true or how much is real. And those ideas are so interesting to me. So I guess I'm saying all this to set up Stephanie's part, which I think it's it was so much fun to read. It was so interesting, and just because I mean it's a cool like magical power that Stephanie has. Like who doesn't want to read about that, you know? But I have to ask you about Stephanie and how you thought about writing into her power and making it like work on the page. Because like I still don't know how you did it, but it works, and it was just so cool. It was so fun to read. So it's also sad, but yeah.
Yeah. Oh my God. I care about this character so much. I love her. And um I was thinking about fiction where these extraordinary abilities or possibilities are sort of just embedded in the mundane work of living a life, and the Avengers never show up to invite her to join. There's no like with extraordinary power comes extraordinary responsibility. It's just the way that living works, where there are things that happen to you and things you can do, you or anyone else, one can do, that no one else ever gets to see, that no one else ever notices. And maybe we can't all make terraces appear in our tiny apartments, but I think there are enormous ways that we impact the world quietly and invisibly, that no one else gets to witness. And if you're alone, and Stephanie is kind of this catastrophically alone character, then really no one gets to witness your impact on the world. And my counter to that was that she still changes the world. She literally changes the shape of the world just by being there. The idea that even if our lives are not seen or shared with other people, they still make the world bigger. So that was, on an emotional level, that was important to me to communicate. And I was thinking about books like The Vet's Daughter, where the main character can just levitate, but it's just a part of her daily life. It's not Hogwarts, which I did not have any interest in writing. So I was thinking about that. And then, Stephanie embodies that formal challenge that we were talking about how to make a reader feel like a narrative is changing shape. And so I did a lot of things with her section that I don't expect anyone to notice, but I hoped they kind of had this like subconscious impact on the way that her chapter was read. It's the only section of the book that contains M dashes. I think the only other ones in the book are when Stephanie is speaking in someone else's chapter. And so I think, that's the largest distance of grammatical or punctuation space that you can have um, in a sentence. And so I wanted her to have access to this like extender shape in her prose. The sentences also, to kind of contradict that, are much more clipped. They're short. The sentence structure is shorter in her section. It's like the opposite of stream of consciousness. It's very jagged and abrupt, and it's divided more into these like small paragraphs. So there's space between each moment, added. There's that little bit of white space, but again, without using kind of visual or formatting tricks, just the things that are available to us in the toolbox of putting words on the page. And so those were some things that I was working with that like, I don't necessarily want them to be visible, but I think there are so many things that contribute to how we experience a character, and some of them we're aware of and some of them we're not. And I wanted there to be both in there.
Yeah, I mean, so I know I shared the story with you right before we recorded, so apologies for telling it again. But this,
Okay.
you just saying this reminded me of what Hernan Diaz, author of Trust, one of my favorite books, was talking about in that interview with him, talking about how he used, small things such as punctuation to differentiate the four parts of his novel. and he had mentioned you during that podcast episode, and now we're talking today, which is just cool. But I
I
think
think
that's really interesting. Oh,
I
sorry, go
think
ahead.
I'm not sure if I'm right about this, but I think he like created a style sheet for each section of his book. So that's a level of commitment that I did not uh reach in my little grammatical, fun that I was having on the page. But I think he did. I think he did that.
Yeah, yeah, he like held up the his like handwritten notes for it, and so it was
Oh
just so
wow.
cool to see like that process and all that. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean I it's interesting to hear about how an author can include those little details that a reader might not pick up on, but it does, you still read it, and so it still subconsciously is doing that work. And I think something that's interesting about this section, and funny that you mentioned the vet's daughter. I read that book I think like 2 years ago. It's really cool. I
Yeah.
didn't like make that connection while reading this, but they are very similar characters, and they're both very, kind of sad narratives. But I think it's interesting, balancing the first part of this book of Terrace. On my initial read, I would love to go back and read this again to see if I'm sure now my impression would be different, but Stephanie almost has like a it almost reads as if like Stephanie might be a little evil or something at the end of Terrace. Is my initial read of like what's like I don't want to spoil it. I'll just say that there's like a little bit of like an
Yeah.
ominous undertone to the end of that part.
Sure.
Um, but then when you get to her section, it completely opens what the reader thinks of her. And there's two elements here I want to ask you about. The first one being Will, and the relationship that she kind of gets in, where she kind of exposes or is vulnerable about her power and shows him it, and eventually what Will does with that information. Um, how did Will factor into this section for you, and how do you think about him?
I really resist narratives where, like you said, there's a character who seems villainous, but then we learn their tragic history and we feel something for them. And it's like, it's not what we thought. I like when it's not just not what we thought, but it's a whole different thing completely. And I don't think it's spoiling too much, but in the first section of the book, Stephanie is intruding on someone's marriage. She's making herself very comfortable in Annie's life, and there's a lot of jealousy there. And then what happens kind of confirms Annie's ugly feelings about this woman. Um, and then, so we're thinking Stephanie is a home wrecker. Stephanie is selfish. So Stephanie is this and that. And then I was like, what if she just has this whole other place where her heart lives and it's not about these people at all? And that felt compelling to me because I think we're often obsessed, or I'm often obsessed with the idea that I've like left an interaction with someone and said everything wrong and ruined their day and like, you know, misstepped, or just I'm obsessed with other people's interpretations of me when everyone's just thinking about themselves. Like it's like no one cares. And so Stephanie is thinking about herself and her pain, and she's in love with this person her whole life who has nothing to do with Annie and Edward, Annie's husband. And they have no sense of that. They only understand her in the context of her role as a supporting character in their world. And I wanted her to be the lead character in her life. And then this person who she kind of devotes her life to loving and considering, and she essentially lives a life with him alone because he occupies so much of her mind and her heart. He betrays her in this terribly crass way. And he has, like Stephanie in Annie and Edward's world, he has this whole other world that Stephanie has never been permitted to see until she does. And so even Will, who is maybe a bad guy and is maybe just a person, he had, Stephanie doesn't have access to his story, and we don't really get full access to it either. But it's like I like thinking of people as bigger than we imagine them to be. And so all of the characters in the book work in that way. They're all not concealing something for the purposes of narrative trickery, but they're more than who they're perceived to be by the people around them. And sometimes that's in a positive direction and sometimes not so much.
Yeah, and you even, kind of use this concept, I think, or writing into this in terms of this idea of grief, which it kind of underpins the entire narrative in subtle ways, I think. But another key component, I think, of Stephanie's story is the loss of her sister at a young age and how she carries that with her. So how did you think about adding that element to Stephanie's story?
At the end of the first sec, I'm like talking around things, trying not to reveal there's this great quote that like uh a book whose plot can be spoiled has already been spoiled by its plot. I think that's what the general gist of it is. So I don't really believe in spoilers, but I do think that there are things in the book that I would love for readers to experience in order firsthand, but in the first section of the book, um there's a terrace and then there isn't, and there's this rift that happens, and it's a magical rift. It's not a rift that we understand or know how to experience necessarily, at least not how it happens to Annie and to her family. But it felt important to me to find a correlation for that in the human experience that we understand, like what does it mean to be cut off irrevocably from people that you love? And the obvious answer was through death, through grief. So it felt important to me that Stephanie should experience the thing that she inflicts on someone else, um, maybe for her whole life. And it's also something that everyone experiences in different ways. So she's struggling with a very relatable kind of rift in her own life and trying to imagine what's on the other side of that divide, where her sister actually is now that she's no longer here. And Annie is feeling similar things, just in a more metaphysical way. Did I
Yeah,
go around things enough? I don't know.
no, that was perfect. I mean, so I wanted to ask you about that because I think it speaks to something that's going through this entire novel, and I'm still kind of grappling with like what it means and how you're working with this concept of extinction, and like climate change, which is kind of like it's not ever, in my opinion, I guess, in my read, it's never like directly addressed. It's kind of just like this kind of lurking presence, which I think, you know, that's a real way of thinking about it. So, but I mean, this kind of really shows up in the last part, which I agree with you. I don't really believe in spoilers, but I think that there's something very exciting about coming to that part and just experiencing it. So I'll tell all listeners, like, read the book and get there and then talk to me about it because I need to talk about it in a spoilery way. But I do want to ask you about extinction and climate change and like these ideas that are included throughout of what it means to lose something irrevocably, or and also how you kind of lean into some humor. Like there's this one quote where I think it's from Folly where it says Anne liked games. She liked the one where you run in a circle until everyone falls over. She liked the duck duck possum. The geese were gone. Like this is little like things that you include. It's funny, it's dark, but so yeah, extinction. What do you want to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I that quote that you picked up on, it was a funny aside, but it actually became a way of thinking about what extinction means more than just losing entire species. But it would change colloquialisms. It would change the way that we describe the world around us, because the way we describe it is informed by what exists. So if geese are no longer here, would the expression silly goose still exist, or would anyone know what that means anymore? That was curious to me, the way that language contracts with the world contracting in scope. And then extinction is another way of talking about space, because I can imagine a certain stingy, billionaire inflected approach to extinction, which imagines that the world gets bigger when there are less things in it, you know? but of course that's not true. The world gets smaller. There's this quote from Joy Williams' most recent book, Harrow, that I think about all the time, and I'm going to mess it up. It's like the world was dying because we were mostly dead to its astonishments, and it would stick around, but it would keep getting less and less until it matched our understanding of it. Like that the world is getting smaller and smaller because we can't see how big it is anymore. And I think about that almost every day, and I think it's um such a terrifying and accurate way of describing the disregard we have for the enormity of life, and not just human life.
Another passage in your book, I'm gonna butcher it as well, but
Let's just butcher everything. It's fine. We're
yeah,
good.
it's all right. The sentiment is
Yeah.
still there. It's about like possessions and like the loneliness of possessions, and it says something along the lines of like, if we're no longer here, like something deeply sad about not have no one being there to have them anymore, and how sad that is. And so it ties to even just objects in our life too.
Yeah.
I
I
think I
think the
butchered it, but
line is,
yeah.
I think it's something like, I'm going to butcher my own sentence. So, so you don't have to feel, but I think it's something like, the world would be a giant walk-in closet with no one left to brag about having a walk-in closet.
Hmm.
And I think that, yeah, maybe I'll just leave it at that. Maybe I won't say anything else.
Yeah, I mean, that's so. This is going to another. If we're talking about sentences here, and if you can't tell, like I try not to just read out quotes in the interviews, but there's so many good ones that I had to. But one more rule that you break in this book that I think is so cool, and I keep asking authors about this. I don't know, I just find it so cool, and I love when authors break rules. But it's when I read Middlemarch, like 2 years ago, that I started thinking about like these kind of form questions. And there's a small part in this book, just to give a quick like setup. It's a direct address to the reader, basically, in which it's talking about a book that one of the characters wrote, and um, the narrator says it's out of print, but you can still find it if you know where to look. And I was like, whoa, like a direct address that comes out of nowhere. So all I have to say, how do you think about like imposing that kind of narration? I think it's so cool, and I love it.
I mean, it was one of the most liberating things about writing this book in the third person, because Temporary was written for the most part, with a couple of chapters accepted, in first person, which I also loved. There's like an intimacy there that's very exciting, and it feels urgent. And and I loved writing it that way. But third person felt, it's like I felt the sands shifting underneath me. I felt like there were whole worlds beneath what I was writing that I could suddenly open the door and have access to. um it's tricky though, because I think that in a book that's so much about perspective, I never wanted it to feel like there was some god figure manipulating the story and the order of the story in order to create an effect. That's not something I was interested in. But it did feel exciting to me to think that maybe there is someone narrating everything, and layered upon all of these mysteries of who the characters are and who they are to the people around them, is there this other character that we never get to meet? um and there's no answer to that question, but that was exciting to think about. And I think the third person has so much space for play like that, as long as you're not tormenting your reader with the kind of false, um like the false spoilers of just prolonged release of information, just for the sake of effect, just for the sake of suspense. That's not something I was interested in. um but yeah, it was another way of making the book a little bit larger suddenly.
So we're talking about all everything that's going on in this book, right? And I'm very curious about you as a reader and what informs your brain and how you come to write a book like this. So I always end every interview with like an open-ended book recommendation question, anything that might have informed this book, all-time favorites, recent reads, anything you want to share.
So one of the books that was hugely influential to me, I read it while I was editing Terrace story, is The Poetics of Space. And I mean, if you're in the mood for some theory, this is the summer read for you, for, hot theory summer. um it's, all about the structure of daydreams and the kind of dream house that our imaginations reside in. And it blew me away. It was so helpful in thinking about how the structure of my novel worked. And he mostly is talking about houses in this book, and he dedicates one passage to apartments and basically says, apartments have no dream structure because they have no attics, they have no cellars. You can't have the heroism of climbing the stairs, you have to take an elevator. Obviously that's a very specific kind of apartment building, but he argued that because they're horizontal in nature, they're just lives stacked upon lives, they don't have the cosmicity of a house with a roof and a basement and like the stars above. And so I started to read that as a dare to find what a daydream looks like when it's dreamed in an apartment, because most of my adult life has been lived in apartments. So that book was really important to me, both as a challenge and as the theoretical underpinning of what I was trying to write. Um, Books that I would recommend, this is kind of funny and I didn't plan it this way, but I've just spent some time reading some of my former professors' newest books. I just read No One Left to Come Looking for You by Sam Lipsyte, and it was so funny. I mean, I just like, if you've never read, have you ever read his books? I
Never
like,
have.
oh my God, he's the funniest writer. It kills me. Like, there's so few books that make me laugh out loud, crying laughing. And Sam is one of those writers. And this book is, it's a period piece. It's about kind of the punk scene in early 90s downtown New York. And it it reveals itself to be not only a period piece as it progresses, it's in conversation with our present moment in really unexpected and clever ways. And I just thought it was so powerful and such a delight. It was so good. Um, he's amazing. And then I just started reading another former professor, Ed Park's new book, which comes out this fall, Same Bed, Different Dreams. And it is wild and unlike anything I've ever read. I've just started it, but every day I want to stop what I'm doing and just go back to reading it. It's unbelievable. Well, a book I'm really excited for. I'm really excited for C. Pam Zhang's new novel, Land of Milk and Honey, which comes out in September. I can't wait to read that.
Yeah, me too. I loved How Much of These Hills is Gold, so I'm really excited. I hear the new one's quite different from the first, which is always cool. Nice. Yeah. So thank you for sharing all those book recommendations. I always get like my best book recs from authors, I find. Like I love keep getting to ask that at the end of these podcast interviews. So thank you for that. And thank you so much for joining me today to talk about this book. I was admittedly I was like, how am I going to tackle Terrace story in an hour? Like it just seems impossible. But this has been so lovely and I'm so glad I got to meet you and just thank you for being a part of reading the room. This is fantastic.
Thank you, Jalen. This was a pleasure, and I feel really grateful to have such a close reader of my work. Thank you.